I walked into a Catholic church during a children's first communion ceremony with 6 men and reaped the bread from the hands of a 7-year-old girl before she could put it in her mouth, because I believed I was saving her from eating something that would damn her soul. But the moment I took that bread from that child's hands, something happened to my body and to every man who entered with me that left 200 parents screaming and the priest standing at the altar with tears running into his vestments, repeating the same 3 words over and over. Have you ever been so certain you were protecting a child that you never once considered you might be the one causing the harm? My name is Rami Tawfiq al-Najjar. I am 29 years old. And on April 23, 2023, I led 6 men into the Church of the Holy Family in Zarqa, Jordan, during the First Communion Mass for 32 children, and I pulled the Eucharist from the fingers of a little girl named Miriam while her mother watched from the second pew. I had no idea that what happened in the next 90 seconds would shatter everything I believed about God and leave me holding a piece of bread that would burn a hole through every wall I had ever built around my heart. I grew up in the Jabal Tariq neighborhood of Zarqa, a working-class city northeast of Amman, where the streets were narrow and the apartment buildings pressed against each other like teeth in a crowded mouth. My father, Sheikh Tawfiq Hamdi al-Najjar, was an imam at the neighborhood mosque who had studied in Medina. He led Friday prayers with a voice that could make grown men weep. My mother, Rami, wore full hijab and ran a Quran school for children out of our apartment every afternoon. Our home sat one street from the mosque. Islam was not just what we believed, it was every wall and every breath in the air around us. While other boys spent afternoons kicking footballs through alleys, I sat on the mosque floor, memorizing the Quran under my father's supervision. By 14, I had completed the memorization. The elder said, "Allah has blessed your parents with a special son." I never missed a prayer. During Ramadan, I fasted with absolute discipline and added voluntary fasts throughout the year. My faith was not performance. It lived in the deepest part of me. But my father taught me that the most dangerous thing Christians did was feed their lies to children. He said the Eucharist was the worst form of shirk because it taught children that bread was the body of God. He said First Communion was child abuse, dressed in white dresses and candles. By 18, I had joined a group of young men who believed it was their duty to resist Christian influence on children. We stood outside churches during catechism classes. We handed pamphlets to Christian parents. I believed I was protecting the innocent. I had no idea that the Jesus I was fighting against had a specific relationship with children I was about to learn in the most devastating way. By 27, I had completed my degree in education from Al-Balqa Applied University and was working as a secondary school teacher in Zarqa. I was engaged to a devout woman named Aya, whose father served on the mosque's board. I had a stable career, a respected name, and the admiration of every elder in my community. I had everything. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever built your entire life on something you were absolutely sure would never break? The trigger was an invitation. One of my students, a 12-year-old Muslim boy named Ahmad, brought a card to school. A Christian classmate had invited him to attend her younger sister's First Communion at the Church of the Holy Family. Ahmad showed me the card with innocent curiosity. The card had a cross on it, a picture of a chalice, and the words, "Come celebrate Miriam's first Holy Communion." The sight of it made my stomach turn. A Christian child was being given what I believed was the body of a false god, and a Muslim child was being invited to witness it. I confiscated the card. That evening, I brought it to our group at the mosque. I held it up and said, "They are inviting our children to watch their children eat what they call the body of God. First they watch, then they taste, then they believe. We cannot let this happen." The room erupted. Someone needed to walk into that ceremony and show those parents, both Christian and Muslim, that the Eucharist was powerless. That feeding a child the body of a dead prophet was not sacred. It was blasphemy. I volunteered to lead the action. I had no idea that the Jesus whose body I planned to take from a child's hands was preparing to teach me something about children that would break me in half. I chose 6 men. Tariq was my oldest friend who shared every conviction. Fadi was a university student who argued against Christianity online. Khaled was a quiet mechanic who showed up for every action. Saeed was a shopkeeper whose daughter had once been given a Christian pamphlet. Wael was a taxi driver who knew every street in Zarqa. And Yunus was my younger cousin, 21 and eager to prove himself. Our target was the 10 o'clock Mass at the Church of the Holy Family on the Sunday of First Communion. Tariq scouted the week before and reported that children would approach the altar in a line and the priest would place bread in their hands. Our plan was simple. Enter during communion, walk to the front, and I would take the bread from the first child's hands before she could consume it. The night before, I prayed Tahajjud at 2 in the morning. I pressed my forehead to the floor and asked Allah for courage. But something happened I could not explain. A weight settled on my chest, so heavy I could barely breathe. My heart raced, my hands trembled against the prayer mat. It felt like something enormous and invisible was pressing down on me from above, not to hurt me, but to warn me. I told myself it was Shaitan trying to weaken my resolve. I barely slept. Have you ever been so convinced you were protecting children that you never once asked whether God Himself might be the one standing between them and you? We arrived at the Church of the Holy Family at 9:50 in the morning. The April air was warm and bright. The church was built of pale limestone, with arched windows and a small courtyard where families were gathered taking photographs of their children. The children. I had not been prepared for the children. 32 boys and girls, all around 7 years old, dressed in white. The girls wore white dresses with lace veils. The boys wore white shirts and dark trousers. They held small candles. They were laughing. Some were nervous, tugging at their parents' hands. Some were spinning in their dresses, watching the fabric swirl. They looked like angels. The sight of them hit me somewhere I was not expecting, somewhere beneath the anger and the ideology and the certainty. But I pushed it down. I focused on the mission. An elderly woman at the door smiled at us as we entered. "Welcome," she said. "There are seats in the back." Inside, the church smelled of incense and melting candle wax and fresh flowers. Arrangements of white lilies stood on either side of the altar. Golden light fell through the stained glass and painted the marble floor in soft colors. The wooden pews were filled with families, mothers in their best dresses, fathers with cameras, grandmothers weeping before the ceremony had even begun. The children sat in the first 2 rows, their white clothing bright against the dark wood. They were fidgeting, whispering, sneaking glances at each other, the way 7-year-olds do when they know something important is about to happen. The organ played softly. There was a peace in that church that pressed against me like a physical weight. It reminded me of the holiest moments I had ever experienced during Ramadan. I pushed the feeling down. The Mass progressed. The priest, a middle-aged Jordanian man with kind eyes and a voice that carried warmth without effort, led the readings, the prayers, the hymns. Then came the moment. The priest consecrated the bread. He raised it above his head. The congregation bowed. The children stood. One by one, they formed a line in the center aisle and began walking toward the altar. Their small hands were clasped in front of them. Some of them were trembling with the seriousness of the moment. The first child in the line was a girl. She was 7. She had dark hair and dark eyes and a white veil pinned to her hair with a small pearl clip. Her mother was filming from the second pew, crying already. The priest placed the communion bread in the girl's small open hands. She lifted it toward her mouth. I moved. I pushed through the pew. I walked fast down the center aisle. I reached the girl in 3 steps. I took the bread from her hands. I snatched it from her open palms before she could close her fingers. She looked up at me with eyes so wide and so full of confusion that for one instant, every belief I held went silent. She did not scream. She did not cry. She just looked at me. Then she whispered, "That is Jesus." 2 words from a 7-year-old that hit me harder than anything any scholar had ever said. The church erupted. Parents shouted. The mother in the second pew screamed. Tariq and the others moved into the aisle. The priest raised both his hands and said in a steady voice, "Brothers, you are welcome here. Please do not frighten the children." But I was already frightened. The child's eyes had done something to me I could not explain, and I was holding the bread. That is when it happened. The moment that changed everything I believed about God. The bread was warm, not room temperature warm, alive warm, like holding a heartbeat. The warmth moved from my palms through my wrists, up my arms, into my chest. My fingers locked. I could not open my hand. I could not drop the bread. I could not move. The air in the church changed. The temperature shifted from the cool of stone to something like standing in direct sunlight. A golden light filled the space from no source I could see. It did not come from the windows. It came from everywhere. And in the center of that light, standing between me and the line of children in their white clothes, was Jesus. He was real. More real than the marble beneath my feet. More real than the bread burning in my hand. His face held an expression I will see every time I close my eyes for the rest of my life. It was not anger. It was the face of a father who has just watched someone reach toward his child. It was fierce and tender and devastating all at once. His eyes were filled with tears, not for himself, for the children, for Miriam, for the 32 small souls in white who had been waiting to receive him. He spoke, not through the air, through every atom of my body. He said, "You took my body from the hands of my child, but you cannot take me from her heart. These children are mine, every one of them. They came here this morning to meet me for the first time, and you tried to stand between us. No one stands between me and my little ones. The bread you are holding is not a symbol, it is me. And the hands you took it from were the hands I love most in all of creation, because they are the hands that have not yet learned to doubt." Tears were pouring down my face. I could not breathe. My knees buckled. I fell to the marble floor with the bread still in my clenched fist. I was sobbing harder than I had ever sobbed in my life. Behind me, I heard bodies hitting the floor. Tariq was on his knees in the aisle, shaking. Fadi was pressed against the pew, weeping. Khalid had backed against the wall and slid to the ground. Saeed and Wael had fled through the side door. Yunis was on his knees beside me, crying with his hands over his face. The children had stopped moving. They stood in their white clothes in a silent line, watching us with eyes that held no fear, only curiosity, only innocence. The parents were frozen. The mother in the second pew had her hands over her mouth, tears streaming through her fingers. Minutes could have been hours. Then the priest walked forward. He knelt beside me on the marble floor. He gently placed his hand over my clenched fist, the fist that held the bread. He said, "He loves you, son. He has been waiting for you. Open your hand." My fingers released. The bread sat in my open palm, unbroken, warm. The priest picked it up with a reverence that made me feel like the smallest person on earth. He turned and walked back to the altar. He knelt before the little girl, Miriam, who had not moved from where she stood. He placed the bread back in her small hands. She looked at it. She looked at the priest. Then she consumed it. And she smiled. The church went silent. Then the parents began to weep. Not from fear, from witnessing something that no human explanation could hold. I had no idea that the bread I stole from a child's hands would be the bread that fed my starving soul. Ask yourself this question. How do you explain the living God standing between a grown man and a 7-year-old girl when everything you believed told you he was powerless? I stayed on that floor for a long time. When the ceremony resumed, when the rest of the children received their communion, I was still kneeling in the aisle. After the Mass, the priest helped me to my feet. He brought me to a small room behind the altar. He said, "What do you want to do now?" I said, "I want to follow him." He held my hands and led me in a prayer that ended everything I was and began everything I am. I said, "Jesus, I took your body from the hands of a child. I tried to stand between you and your little ones, and you did not strike me down. You wept for me. Forgive me. I know you are real. I surrender everything." The priest embraced me. Then the door opened. Miriam's mother stood in the doorway. Her face was streaked with tears. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she walked forward and hugged me. She whispered, "Miriam told me to come. She said the man who took the bread needs a hug." I broke again. A 7-year-old girl whose communion I had desecrated sent her mother to comfort me. What happened next changed everything. Within a month, 5 of the 6 men gave their lives to Jesus. Tariq first, then Fadi, Khaled, and Yunis within weeks. Saeed took 2 months, while I have not heard from since. I was baptized 3 months later at the Church of the Holy Family. The priest who had knelt beside me on the floor performed the ceremony. I chose the name Matthew because Matthew had been a man despised by everyone who met Jesus and followed him immediately. Miriam and her mother sat in the front row. Miriam wore her white dress again. The cost came fast. My father's face when I told him was the worst thing I have ever seen. He aged 10 years in 10 seconds. He said, "You are no longer my son. You are dead to us. You disgraced our family in front of the entire community." His voice was not cold. It was broken. That was worse. My mother wept for 3 days. She sent me a message that said, "How could you do this? You were supposed to teach children, not follow their religion." She blocked my number. Aya came to my apartment and placed the ring on the table. She said nothing. She just looked at me with an expression of complete incomprehension and walked out. I lost my teaching position within 2 weeks. The school could not keep me after the community learned what happened. Friends held a janaza prayer. Death threats came by the 4th week. I eventually had to leave Zarqa for a smaller town where a Christian family from the church took me in. That is when it happened again. Not a vision. A peace so complete it filled every room the losses had emptied. I had lost everything, but I gained everything that truly matters. Jesus, forgiveness, peace that did not require a classroom or a salary or a family name to exist, and the calling that burns in me brighter than anything I ever felt standing in front of a mosque. It was through the church community that I met Lara. She was a Jordanian Christian nurse with gentle hands and the faith that had survived her own family's persecution during the civil tensions years earlier. I told her everything. She wept, not for the story, but for the 7-year-old who sent her mother to hug the man who stole her bread. We were married 6 months later at the Church of the Holy Family. The same priest officiated. Tarek, Fadi, Khaled, and Yunis stood beside me. Miriam, now 8, carried flowers. Today, I work in children's ministry across Jordan. I visit churches and teach catechism classes to the very age group I once tried to disrupt. Over 60 Muslims have given their lives to Jesus after hearing my testimony. But the detail that breaks people every time is not the light or the vision or the collapse. It is the 7-year-old girl who said 2 words. That is Jesus. I returned to the Church of the Holy Family last Easter and knelt at the altar where I had fallen. The priest placed the body of Christ in my hands, the same hands that had once stolen it from a child. I consumed it with tears running down my face. I still send letters to my parents twice a year. I tell them I love them. I tell them about Lara and about our son, Elias, whose first communion is next spring. No response from my father. But my mother sent a message through my aunt last Christmas. It said, "I dream about white dresses and children holding candles. I do not know why." Ask yourself this question. If a 7-year-old girl holding a piece of bread understood something about God that a 29-year-old man with a memorized Quran could not, what does that tell you about where God actually lives? The Muslim man who stole the Eucharist from the hands of a child no longer exists. In his place stands a follower of Jesus Christ who now places that same bread into children's hands every Sunday and weeps every single time because he knows what he is giving them. If he can transform someone like me, someone who walked into a church full of 7-year-olds in white dresses and tried to stand between them and God, then he can absolutely transform you. No matter what you have done or where you come from. Will you let him in? Or will you keep standing in the aisle between him and the part of you that has been waiting since childhood to receive something your hands were always meant to hold.